an injured enlisted soldier to safety and tends to the wounded, realizing a first-hand insight of the horrors of war and left him jaded to life on the battlefield. Later, Newton discovers that slave owners with 20 or more slaves are spared from fighting and are allowed to return home. Fighting in someone else's war makes him even more weary and frustrated. Late into the night, while taking a piss, Daniel, a teen farm kid from his hometown, emerges from the dark crying. The young boy then informs Newton that his family's possessions have been taken and that he has been forcibly drafted to fight. Daniel asks Newton to accompany him on tomorrow's advance in hopes of making it out alive. Without a second thought, Newton agrees. The next day, Newton and Daniel are engaged in combat together. Newton briefs Daniel to only heed his commands and not to listen to any NCOs or officers. The two then get ahead of the charge and into a trench. Suddenly, a squadron arrives at the same trench, and a sergeant orders the two to move along. Newton hesitates and then Daniel gets shot, and Newton drags him a long distance away from the fighting. Newton reassures the dying young man that he is not going to die. He tried bringing him to the makeshift hospital, but due to the number of injured, they were ignored. Eventually, Daniel passes away. Newton decides to return his remains to his mother in Jones County and be properly buried. Newton deserts the Confederate Army and returns to his hometown carrying Daniel's remains in a mule. Later, he goes to his farm and wife, Serena. He then explains his sentiments about the war and his reasons for deserting. Soon, he discovers that another family's property has been confiscated by Confederate forces as a form of tax and to help with the war effort. Days later, Newton and Serena's infant boy gets sick, so he seeks medical help at the nearby roadhouse. Instead, Aunt Sally refers him to a slave named Rachel, who's known in the area as a wonderful healer. Soon, she arrives at the knight's residence and looks after the child. The setting jumps to 1947, when Newton's great-grandson, Davis, is facing charges. He is Newton's descendant, making him 1/8 black, and he is accused of marrying a white woman, which was unlawful at the time. Back in the past, Newton visits to see the farm family whose animals were about to be taken. The little family would not be able to survive the winter without the livestock. As a result, Newton equips the mother and her 3 young girls with rifles and instructs them on how to use them. The lead officer, Lieutenant Barber, along with other cavalry officers, arrives, indicating that he is looking for defectors. Newton, the mother, and the daughters are all pointing their rifles at the officers. Newton also prepared by sticking sticks out of the barn to look as if there are others in the barn. The bluff works and the soldiers depart but promise to return. The soldiers approach Newton's residence and unleash their hounds on him. Newton is chased by one of the dogs and is bitten while attempting to jump over a fence. He takes out his knife and stabs the dog, killing it instantly. With nowhere else to go, he asks the help of Aunt Sally. She then lends her slave named George, who guides Newton through the swamp. George then instructs Newton to wait. Hours later, he is greeted by Rachel, who then guides him to a group of runaway slaves led by a man with a slave collar, named Moses Washington. After a brief exchange, Moses treats Newton's leg wound. Wanted posters of Newton are posted everywhere. After Newton becomes a fugitive, Serena decides to leave her home with their only child. This strengthens Davis's case because it was already known that Serena had left and hence could not have had another kid with Newton. Among the other runaways, Newton and Moses develop a relationship, and staying with them day in and day out, he gradually begins to care for the rest of them, which at the time was rather peculiar. Newton assists Moses in removing a metal slave collar from his neck. Soon, George delivers some guns and they arm themselves against the slave catchers that pass by their swampy refuge. From time to time, Rachel goes to visit Newton, where he teaches her to read and shoot. Vicksburg falls to Union forces in July 1863, prompting a rise in Confederate men deserting. Among them are Newton's old pals in the service, and many of the others discover the swamp and join Newton and his gang of fugitives. While Lieutenant Barber is on the way back from a supply run, Newton and a few others hold them up in the cover of the woods. Soon after the incident, Lieutenant reports the situation to Captain Hood that they call themselves the Freemen of Jones County. The captain disregards them, stating that he doesn't want to tackle a few deserters. Back at the swamp, they soon organize a militia against the Confederates and creates a small community within the swamp, where they harvest grain and build a shelter. With tensions rising, Newton takes advantage of the situation to recruit more to join their cause. Moments later, the Confederates continues to ransack and force their way into acquiring more supplies. They soon discover a hidden corn supply and attempt to flee with it, but Newton's men got wind of it and they came in full force, more than 100 men, and corner the Confederates along with a lieutenant in the woods to get back the corn. The freeman of Jones County celebrates the large haul and even didn't bother to hide the smoke from cooking a hog. With their numbers and with the swamp as a natural obstacle for the cavalry, they're confident to win in case of a confrontation. Captain Hood approaches Aunt Sally at her shop to encourage Newton to disband his group and offers them full pardon as long as they go back to the front lines, otherwise, they will carry out public hangings. When that fails, the soldiers set fire to barns and continue to offer pardons to militia members who lay down their arms. Then Newton rallies his troops to fight back. Ward, who's hiding with Newton in the swamps, had enough and somehow convinces another deserter and 2 boys to give up. The lieutenant arranges the surrender, but when Captain Hood saw that there were only a few of them, he ordered them to be hanged. At their funeral, Newton arouses the crowd's emotions in order to persuade them that now is the moment to fight back. The militia retaliates by having Moses and a couple of other men in coffins appear out of nowhere and fire at the soldiers. Many soldiers are hit and killed in the ensuing shootout. When Hood got shot, he runs inside a small chapel. Newton sees the wounded captain, follows him, and corners him under a bench. He fires a few shots at Hood but never intends to hit him. Instead, he kills Hood by strangling him and dragging his body outside. A year later, the militia, which has grown in size over the months, takes the fight to the Confederates. The militia eventually defeats the army. The Confederate flag is taken down and the American flag is raised. The people are ecstatic with their triumph. Newton leads Rachel to a private room with her own bed. She is overcome with emotion and begins to cry. In retaliation, Colonel Lowry and his troops are marched down to Ellisville, preparing to dispatch a regiment against the militia. Newton gathers everyone and delivers a speech to them. He reads from a document outlining the terms of their future free state of Jones. The militia manages to hold out until the end of the war and continues to prosper. The freemen have developed their land. And soon, Moses is reunited with his wife and child. However, the government's promise of giving each freedman 40 acres and a mule is revoked months later. Despite this, the town grows, including the establishment of a school where Rachel teaches people to read. Soon, Serena returns to Jones County along with her son. She describes how her life has changed after she left him, including how her barns had been destroyed by fire. Although Newton lives with Rachel, they welcome Serena and ask them to stay in the neighborhood. When his son is kidnapped by slave owners, Moses sets off to get him back. Newton keeps a close eye on him to make sure he doesn't die. Although the war has ended, slaves are still being worked in the fields a year after their freedom. Moses accompanies his son but is ambushed by 2 slavers armed with rifles. Newton steps in to help and is eventually tried in court for his actions. He denies the charges leveled against him and pays off the slave owner $70 to get Moses' son back. Months passed and Rachel gives birth. Serena is seen assisting Rachel in caring for the infant. Years later, when Davis is trying to ascertain if he descended from Rachel or Serena, this is brought to everyone's attention in the court of law. Newton's family Bible, which provides written documentation that Rachel delivered birth, which adds strong evidence to the prosecutors. With the opportunity to vote for a person of color that's on their side, Moses goes around gathering information from freedmen and slaves. At the same time, he encourages them to join them and vote for their future. But then, he is followed by a group of angry white folks. When the news reached, Newton tried to find his friend. He continues searching until he comes across Moses' body hung from a tree. Moses was lynched and humiliated. The community deeply mourns this loss. Election day arrives, all eyes are on Newton and his people as they march to vote. When he gets to the voting hall, Newton requests Republican tickets. The racist white men hesitated to give them a chance at first but eventually, gives them the tickets after Newton and the others didn't flinch. After the vote, it is stated that the Democratic vote beats the Republican by a huge number. As Union troops are withdrawn, Klan activity increases over the next few years. Thousands of African Americans are killed in the run-up to the 1876 election. Due to their current circumstance, Rachel is concerned for herself and their child. In the modern court, Davis is given bail as the conclusion of his court sentence on the condition that his marriage is to be annulled and that he leaves Mississippi.